In the suffocating summer heat of Marion, Indiana, in July 1940, a 9-year-old boy with piercing blue eyes sat motionless beside his mother's deathbed, his small hand clutching hers as if he could somehow anchor her soul to this world. Through sheer force of will, the air in that modest bedroom was thick with the smell of medication and impending loss, punctuated only by the labored breathing of the woman who had been his entire universe. Mildred Dean, just 39 years old and still beautiful despite the ravages of uterine cancer, was slipping away from her son with each passing moment. And with her fading breath, she was unknowingly creating one of Hollywood's most tragic and enduring legends. The death of Mildred Dean didn't just claim the life of a devoted mother. It forged the wounded, searching soul that would become James Dean, the rebel whose exquisite pain would captivate and break the hearts of millions around the world. This is the untold story of how a mother's love and devastating loss created an icon whose influence still reverberates through popular culture today. It's the story of how 9 months of watching someone you love disappear can shape every relationship, every performance, and every desperate act of rebellion that follows. Most people know James Dean as the leather-jacketed rebel who died too young. But they don't understand that his entire identity was built on the foundation of this first, most profound loss: the death of the only person who truly saw and understood his sensitive soul. James Byron Dean was born on February 8, 1931, in Marion, Indiana, to Winton Dean, a practical dental technician with steady hands and even steadier expectations for conventional life, and Mildred Marie Wilson Dean, a woman whose artistic soul seemed almost too luminous for the conservative confines of small-town Indiana in the 1930s. But from the very first moments of his life, it became clear that James belonged to his mother in a way that transcended ordinary parent-child bonds. Their connection was spiritual, creative, almost mystical in its intensity. Mildred was everything her husband was not. Where Winton was pragmatic, she was dreamlike. Where he valued stability and conformity, she celebrated imagination and individuality. She had auburn hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through their kitchen window like spun copper, expressive hazel eyes that seemed to hold entire universes of unspoken emotions, and elegant hands that could coax haunting melodies from the old upright piano that dominated their small living room. She moved through their modest home like a dancer, humming fragments of songs that existed only in her mind, filling every corner with an almost palpable sense of magic and possibility. When Mildred looked at her son, she saw not just another child destined for the ordinary path of Midwestern life, but a kindred spirit, someone who had inherited her profound sensitivity, her insatiable creativity, and her desperate need to express the inexpressible emotions that seemed too large for any single human heart to contain. James was born with what his mother recognized as an artist's soul, and she was determined to nurture that gift, even in a world that often viewed such sensitivity as weakness rather than strength. These forgotten stories deserve to be told. If you think so too, subscribe and like this video. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. While Winton Dean worked long hours at the dental practice, maintaining the steady income that kept their small family afloat, Mildred transformed their modest home into a sanctuary of artistic exploration. She would spend entire afternoons reading to James, her voice painting vivid pictures of faraway places and impossible adventures that existed only in the pages of books and the limitless landscape of imagination. She introduced him to poetry, whispering verses from Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman as if sharing sacred secrets. She taught him to play piano guiding his small fingers across the keys while singing in a voice so beautiful it seemed to make the very air shimmer with emotion. Most importantly, she taught him to see beauty in everything. The way morning light filtered through their kitchen window, creating dancing patterns on the floor. The intricate sound of rain against glass, like nature's own percussion. The delicate mathematical architecture of a spider's web, glistening with dewdrops in their garden. But Mildred's greatest gift to her son wasn't cultural education or artistic training. It was permission. In a world that demanded conformity, that punished difference, that tried to force sensitive souls into rigid molds of acceptable behavior, Mildred gave James something revolutionary: permission to be extraordinary. She told him that his sensitivity wasn't something to hide or apologize for, but something to celebrate and cultivate. She explained that his ability to feel deeply, to see beauty where others saw ordinary, to understand emotions that had no names. These weren't weaknesses, but superpowers that would someday allow him to touch hearts and change lives. During those precious early years, mother and son developed their own secret language of understanding. James would come home from school, often upset because other children had mocked his artistic interests or his reluctance to conform to traditional masculine expectations. And Mildred would wrap him in her arms and remind him that the world's greatest artists, writers, and performers had all been misunderstood in their time. She would tell him stories of legendary figures who had been outcasts before they became icons, who had been rejected before they were celebrated, who had suffered before they had triumphed. But their perfect world, this magical cocoon of understanding and unconditional love, began to develop sinister cracks when James was 8 years old. It started with what seemed like minor complaints. Mildred would experience severe stomach pains that left her doubled over in their kitchen, clutching the countertop until her knuckles turned white. She would wave off James's concerned questions with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, insisting that it was just stress or something she had eaten. In 1940, medical understanding of women's health was primitive at best, and doctors routinely dismissed female complaints as hysteria or nerves, rather than investigating serious underlying conditions. For months, Mildred suffered in silence, not wanting to worry her sensitive son or burden her practical husband with fears that might prove groundless. She continued their daily piano lessons, even when the pain made it difficult to sit upright, maintained their afternoon reading sessions, even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, and never let James see how much she was struggling. But children, especially sensitive children like James, are remarkably perceptive about the people they love most. He began to notice small changes, the way his mother's hands shook slightly when she played piano, how she would pause in the middle of stories and press her hand to her stomach, the growing shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. When the doctors finally discovered the truth, it came like a thunderbolt that shattered their carefully constructed world of beauty and possibility. Uterine cancer, they told the family in the clinical, emotionless language that medical professionals used to distance themselves from the human catastrophe they were announcing. By the time the diagnosis was made, the disease had already begun its merciless advance through Mildred's body, spreading with the inexorable determination of something that recognized no boundaries, respected no dreams, honored no love. The months that followed were a devastating education in loss for young James. A masterclass in helplessness that would shape his understanding of love and mortality for the rest of his life. He watched his vibrant, creative mother transform with horrifying speed from the dancing, singing, laughing woman who had filled his world with magic into a fragile shadow who struggled to complete the simplest daily tasks. The woman who had once moved through their house like a graceful spirit now needed help walking from the bedroom to the bathroom. The hands that had played beautiful melodies now shook with weakness and pain. The voice that had filled his imagination with stories and songs now whispered through gritted teeth, battling agony that no 9-year-old should have to witness. James became his mother's constant companion, her devoted shadow, her fiercely protective guardian in a battle that he was too young to understand, but old enough to know was being lost. He would wake up before dawn to check on her, tiptoeing into her bedroom to make sure she was still breathing, that she was still there, that the terrible disease hadn't stolen her away in the darkness. When she was too weak to read the books they had once shared, he would read to her in his small, earnest voice, stumbling over difficult words, but pushing through because he knew that hearing stories transported her, however briefly, away from the prison of her failing body. He brought her flowers from their garden, daisies and roses and wildflowers whose names she had taught him, arranging them in water glasses beside her bed because they didn't own proper vases. He would sit for hours holding her hand, as if his 9-year-old touch contained some magical healing power that could anchor her soul to this world through sheer force of love and determination. Sometimes she would drift in and out of consciousness, and during her lucid moments, she would squeeze his hand and smile at him with a love so pure and desperate it seemed to illuminate the entire room. During those terrible, precious final months, Mildred did something that would echo through every day of her son's remaining life. She used her fading strength to prepare him for a world without her. She spoke to him about inner strength and artistic integrity, with an urgency that went beyond normal maternal guidance. She made him promise to never let anyone dim his light, to never apologize for his sensitivity, to never compromise his authentic self for the approval of people who couldn't understand the rare gift he possessed. She told him that he was destined for something extraordinary, something that would require tremendous courage and unshakable faith in his own vision. These weren't just the desperate words of a dying mother trying to comfort her son. They were prophecies delivered by someone who understood that her death would either destroy James completely or forge him into something unprecedented. She seemed to know, with the eerie intuition that sometimes comes to those who are dying, that her loss would become the foundation of his artistry, that his grief would transform into a gift that could touch millions of hearts, that his pain would become a language that could speak to anyone who had ever felt lost or misunderstood or abandoned. She spoke to him about love, real love, the kind that transcends physical presence and survives even death. She explained that the love between them wasn't dependent on her being alive to express it, that it would live inside him forever, guiding his choices and protecting him from despair. She told him that whenever he felt lost or scared or alone, he could close his eyes and remember this feeling, this absolute certainty of being completely known and unconditionally accepted, and that memory would be his compass for the rest of his life. But perhaps most importantly, she made him understand that his extraordinary sensitivity, the quality that made other children tease him, and that worried his practical father, was actually his greatest strength. She explained that artists, real artists, were people who could feel everything more intensely than ordinary people, who could access emotions that others couldn't reach, who could translate the deepest human experiences into something beautiful and meaningful. She told him that his ability to be wounded was directly connected to his ability to heal others. that his capacity for pain was matched only by his capacity for compassion. If you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support means everything to us. On July 14, 1940, Mildred Dean lost her battle with cancer in the modest bedroom where she had once sung lullabies to her infant son. The official cause of death was listed as complications from uterine carcinoma. But what really died that day was much more than one woman's life. The end came quietly, without drama or sudden crisis. Just the gradual cessation of breathing as James held her hand and whispered that he loved her, that he would remember everything she had taught him, that he would make her proud. In that devastating moment, when her breathing finally stopped, when her hand went limp in his, when the woman who had been his entire world became just still flesh and fading warmth, something fundamental shattered inside 9-year-old James Dean. The unconditional love that had been his foundation, the artistic guidance that had been his compass, the emotional safety that had been his sanctuary. All of it vanished in an instant that seemed to stretch into eternity. James Dean's childhood died with his mother that July day. And from its ashes would rise a young man driven by an insatiable hunger for love and an absolute, bone-deep terror of abandonment. The house fell into a silence that seemed to have weight and substance, pressing down on everyone who remained. Mildred Dean, overwhelmed by his own grief and completely unprepared to deal with his sensitive, artistic son's emotional needs, made arrangements with mechanical efficiency. There would be a funeral, there would be burial, there would be the grim, practical details that death always demands. But none of these rituals could address the real catastrophe, the complete destruction of James's emotional universe. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and devastating in its finality. Mildred Dean, drowning in his own grief and completely overwhelmed by the prospect of raising a sensitive, artistic child as a single parent, made the decision that would complete his son's emotional destruction. Within weeks of Mildred's death, he made arrangements to send James to live with his sister Hortense and her husband Marcus Winslow on their farm in Fairmount, Indiana. For Winton, this seemed like the practical solution. The Winslows were family, they had no children of their own, and they could provide the stability and care that he felt incapable of offering. But for James, this wasn't just a change of address or living arrangements. It was the final, devastating confirmation that love was temporary, that people would always leave, that even the parent who remained couldn't be trusted to stay. It was exile from everything familiar, abandonment by the one person who should have protected him, and the crushing realization that his own father viewed him as a burden too difficult to bear. The boy who had just lost his mother was now losing his father as well, not to death, but to something perhaps even more painful: rejection and abandonment by choice. The train ride to Fairmount became a journey into a new kind of existence for James, one defined by emotional disconnection and profound mistrust. As the Indiana countryside rolled past his window, he wasn't just traveling to a new home. He was traveling away from any remaining sense of security or belonging. The Winslows were good people, kind and well-meaning, who tried their best to care for their traumatized nephew. But they were rural, practical folks who had no understanding of the artistic, sensitive child who had suddenly appeared in their lives. Marcus Winslow was a farmer who measured success in crops harvested and bills paid, while Hortense, though loving in her way, was a woman who valued conformity and traditional masculine behavior. They provided James with food, shelter, clothing, and basic care. But they couldn't provide what he really needed: understanding of his artistic nature, validation of his sensitivity, or healing for the massive emotional wound that his mother's death and father's abandonment had left in his soul. They treated his difference as something to be cured rather than celebrated, his emotions as weaknesses to be overcome rather than strengths to be developed. In this environment, James became a restless, searching soul who threw himself into activities with an almost desperate intensity, as if constant motion and achievement could somehow fill the void where unconditional love used to exist. He excelled in basketball and baseball, not out of natural athletic passion, but because achievement might earn him the approval and acceptance he craved. He threw himself into these pursuits with the same intensity he had once brought to piano lessons with his mother, seeking in sports the validation and belonging that had died with Mildred. When he discovered drama class at Fairmount High School, something profound shifted in James's entire relationship with the world. On stage, he found something he hadn't experienced since his mother's death. A place where his sensitivity was not just accepted, but required. Where his ability to access deep emotions was viewed as a gift rather than a liability. Where he could become anyone, feel anything, and for brief, precious moments, forget the devastating loss that shadowed every aspect of his existence. Acting became more than a hobby or even a passion. It became his salvation, his therapy, his way of processing grief too enormous for his young heart to contain. But it was during these formative teenage years in Fairmount that the patterns emerged. Psychological and emotional patterns that would define James Dean's entire approach to life, love, and human relationships for his remaining 15 years. He formed intense, almost desperate attachments to people, particularly older women who reminded him consciously or unconsciously of his mother's nurturing presence. He pursued these relationships with a hunger that bordered on obsession, as if the right person could somehow heal the fundamental wound in his soul and restore the sense of safety and unconditional love he had lost. His first serious romantic relationship was with his high school drama teacher, a sophisticated older woman who recognized his talent and took a special interest in his development. This affair, scandalous by 1940s small-town standards, wasn't just teenage rebellion or simple attraction. It was James's desperate attempt to recreate the maternal love he had lost, to find in this woman's arms the nurturing, understanding, and artistic validation that had died with Mildred. He didn't just want romance from her. He wanted complete emotional fusion, the kind of total understanding and acceptance that he had experienced only once before in his life. Yet beneath this desperate search for connection lay a deep-seated, almost pathological belief that everyone he loved would eventually leave him, just as his mother had been taken from him and his father had chosen to send him away. This created a devastating cycle in his relationships. He would pursue people with overwhelming intensity, desperate to recreate that perfect bond he had lost, but then sabotage those relationships through jealousy, possessiveness, or reckless behavior because he couldn't bear to wait for the inevitable abandonment he was convinced would come. This psychological pattern would follow James throughout his life, shaping not just his romantic relationships, but his friendships, his professional collaborations, and ultimately his artistic choices. He lived in constant tension between desperate need for connection and absolute terror of loss, between the hunger to be completely known and understood, and the fear that such vulnerability would only make the eventual abandonment more devastating. When James finally made his way to Hollywood in the early 1950s, he carried his mother's memory like both a blessing and a curse, both inspiration and burden. Every role he chose, every emotion he accessed on screen, every moment of raw vulnerability he brought to his performances could be traced back to those 9 months spent watching Mildred fade away, and the 15 years spent trying to process the grief and abandonment that followed. His famous method acting technique wasn't just professional skill. It was a direct channel to the reservoir of loss, longing, and pain he had been carrying since childhood. In East of Eden, when Cal Aronson begs his father for love and acceptance, James wasn't just playing a character. He was reliving his own desperate need for parental approval. In Rebel Without a Cause, when Jim Stark searches for authentic connection in a world of superficial relationships, James was channeling his own lifelong quest to recreate the unconditional love he'd lost. In Giant, when Jet Rink pursues wealth and status to prove his worth, James was expressing the deep insecurity that had haunted him since his mother's death convinced him he wasn't enough to make someone stay. The tragic irony is that Mildred Dean's death didn't just create James Dean, the troubled young man. It created James Dean, the icon. His ability to access profound emotion, to convey vulnerability with devastating authenticity, to embody the beautiful pain of youth. All of these qualities that made him legendary stemmed directly from his childhood trauma. He became the perfect vessel for expressing the universal experience of loss, the spokesperson for every young person who'd ever felt abandoned or misunderstood. Mildred had wanted her son to let his light shine, and in the most heartbreaking way possible, her death ensured that he would. The same sensitivity that made losing her so devastating also made him capable of touching millions of hearts. The same desperate need for love that drove him to destructive relationships also drove him to performances that revealed the deepest truths about human longing. The same fear of abandonment that made him reckless in his personal life also made him fearless in his artistic choices. On September 30th, 1955, when James Dean died in that car crash on Highway 466, he was still, in many ways, that 9-year-old boy racing toward a reunion with his mother. His death completed a circle that had begun 15 years earlier in that Indiana bedroom. The boy who'd lost his mother too soon became the man who joined her too young, leaving behind a legacy that proved love, once experienced in its purest form, never truly dies. Mildred Dean lived for only 39 years. But through her son's immortal performances, her influence continues to touch hearts around the world. Every time someone watches James Dean on screen and feels understood in their pain, every time his vulnerability gives someone permission to embrace their own sensitivity, every time his rebellion inspires someone to live authentically, Mildred's spirit lives on. She raised a son who would become a legend, not despite his brokenness, but because of it. The mother he lost created not just James Dean the actor, but James Dean the eternal symbol of youth, beauty, and tragic possibility. In losing everything, he gained the ability to speak for everyone who'd ever felt lost. In being broken, he became whole enough to heal others. In dying young, both mother and son achieved a kind of immortality that transcends the boundaries between life and art, love and loss, tragedy and triumph. James Dean once said, "Death is the only thing left to respect." Perhaps what he meant was that death, his mother's death, had taught him the true value of love, the preciousness of time, and the importance of living authentically while we can. Mildred Dean's greatest gift to her son wasn't just life. It was the profound understanding that love, once given purely, creates ripples that extend far beyond any single lifetime. In her death, she didn't just shape a legend. She created a mirror for the human condition itself, reflecting back our own capacity for beauty, pain, and transcendent connection. James Dean lived only 24 years, But those years were filled with stories the world never heard. Stories of love, pain, rebellion, dreams that died too soon. This channel exists to tell those stories, to remember not just the icon, but the man. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe, because James Dean's story isn't over. Not yet.